right, let's go ahead and get started. In this project, we're going to set it to 16 bits per channel. So just alt-click until we get to 16 bits per channel. Then let's create a new composition. Make this 1920 by 1080. This all looks good, 10 seconds, and we'll call this decay. And we'll hit OK. All right, so first thing we want to do is create our source title. So we'll take the text tool, we'll come in here and we'll type in decay, and we'll scale this up. And then we'll pre-compose this, layer, pre-compose. We're going to move all attributes. We're going to call this decay alpha. Then we'll hit OK. Now, in order to get to all of the crazy fun effects, we need to set up our basic title. So to do that, we're going to duplicate this alpha, edit, duplicate, and then we're going to pre-compose it. So we'll choose layer, pre-compose. And we're going to move all the attributes, and we're going to call this decay bevel. And hit OK. Then if we open this up, we can set up our bevel profile similar to how we did it in the last tutorial. So we'll choose layer, layer style, inner glow. We'll go down to the settings here. We'll set it to normal, set it to 100% opacity, set the color to black, hit OK. And we're going to set the technique to precise. And then as we increase the size here, we can see that it creates this inner glow that's perfectly aligned to the edge. Now, I'm going to set the size to about 20. All right, so that looks good. The other thing we want to do is get rid of the alpha channel. So we'll create an adjustment layer. We'll do an effect called Channel Solid Composite, and this just adds a color into the background. We'll do black, hit OK. Let me set this to full resolution. And just to avoid some aliasing, let's add a fast blur. We'll choose blur, fast box blur. We'll do like 1 pixel, 1 iteration, repeat edge pixels. So let's go back to the decay comp, and we'll set up our title with the 3D lighting. So if we go over here to our project, we've got a couple of different things here. We've got this grunge pick and this rock texture. So let's take the rock grunge, drop it out here, and I want to pre-compose it. So I'll choose layer, pre-compose, and we'll move all the attributes, and we'll just call this rock texture, and hit OK. Now, to create our 3D looking title, we're going to use an effect called CC Glass. So we'll go in here, stylize CC Glass. And what we're going to do is go into the surface settings, and we're going to select our decay bevel as the bump. And now we can see that it's starting to displace. Now, in this case, we're going to set the softness down to 0, and we're going to set the displacement down to 0. So we just want to create some of the relighting. Now, in order to get rid of the background, we're going to use an effect called Channel Set Matte. And for this, we're going to select our decay alpha. Now, we're using that in order to create a perfect cutout. Now, I'll go and turn these 2 layers off at the bottom. Now, we'll turn off the transparent background, set this to full res, zoom out here. Now, if I select our rock texture, we can go to the lighting settings and change it from the built-in lights to the AE lights. And what this will allow us to do is create our own real 3D lights. So if we go up here, we could choose Layer, New, Light. We'll choose a parallel light and hit OK. And so you can see if we move this around, we're actually adjusting the lighting of this title. So already, this is a pretty cool technique for creating some nice looking 3-dimensionalized text. But we're going to take it a little bit further. We'll move one of the lights over here to the side and maybe hit P and push it back a little bit. And then we'll create a new ambient light, maybe at 50%. And maybe just one more point light that has just a little bit of an accent color, maybe some blue. We'll move that over to the side, maybe push it into Z space a bit. And that way we're just lighting up the edges. Now we'll take our parallel light, hit T, and let's turn up the intensity of the light. And P, and we'll push it back a bit. Alright, so now we want to create a more rocky edge. And what I want to do is lock our comp, double click on the bevel, and then just move this over to the side. Now we want to add a little bit of texture to our bevel. So what we're going to do is inside of the decay bevel comp, let's create a new solid. And we'll call this rock fractal. And hit OK. Then we're going to add the fractal noise effect. Now, one thing you might notice is this little command. It's called Effects Console. It's free. You could get it from videocopilot.net, or you can go over here to Effects and Presets and just type it in. Fractal noise will drop that on our layer. Now, one problem is that the fractal is taking over the entire title. But if we change the transfer mode to additive, then it'll only affect the ridge. But I think it's a little bit too noisy. So there's another option that looks pretty cool. It's called Max. And one thing I like to do is just turn the invert on, and it creates more concave cutouts. Now, we can play around with the brightness and contrast, and this will affect the way that it cuts out the bevel. I could drop this down just a bit. And another thing I like to do is create a little bit of an indentation. Now, one way to think about this is that we're adding and subtracting lightness. So what I'll do is take the decay alpha, duplicate it, Control D, or Edit Duplicate, and I'm going to put it on top. Then I'm going to choose Channel Invert, and then I'm going to add a fast box blur. And we'll crank this up just a little bit. And now you can see that the way it's affecting it, it's sort of changing it a little bit, but I'm going to turn the opacity down. So I hit T and just lower this down. And so look at the ridge now. So if I turn it off, it's flat. And if I turn it on, this just creates a bit of an indentation. Now, even though we have a nice rock texture, I want to add some real physical indentation. So we'll create a new solid, and we'll call this Rock Dense, and hit OK. Then we'll add the fractal noise effect. Now for this one, we're going to set it to multiply. Then we'll zoom in here, and we're going to increase the brightness. And so now we leave these little small patches, and that creates these nice rocky dents. So let's turn the contrast down just a bit, and maybe turn up the brightness a bit. We could even do something like a sharpen unsharp mask, and this will make it even sharper looking. So that nice bit of variation where we have texture, we have indentation, that really adds to the realism of the base texture. Then we could go over here and just hit T and lower the opacity to say 50%. And that way we're not doing too much indentation. So maybe 70%. That looks good. All right, so I'll go and close the bevel profile, and now we can start having some fun. All right, let's set up a background. I have this rock grunge texture. Drop it in there. We'll choose Effect Curves, and we're just going to darken it down, and just make sure it's darker than the title. I think that looks pretty good. Now for this example, we're going to create a long shadow. So to do that, I'm going to actually take a copy of the alpha channel and choose Edit, Duplicate. We'll put it right underneath our rock texture. And we'll rename a few of these layers. So we'll call this Title. Take the one below it. We'll hit Enter. We'll call this Shadow. We'll turn it on. And we'll solo it. Now currently it's white. We'll go ahead and choose Color Correction, Tint, and we'll make it black. Now to make this into a shadow, we're going to choose Effect, Blur, CC Radial Blur. And we'll change the type to Fading Zoom. And then we're going to move the center up really high, so we can just zoom out, and we'll just put it way up here. And then we'll increase the amount. And if we turn that off solo mode, we can start to see our shadow. Now, we want to somewhat match the angle of our light. And we could probably set up an expression, but just for this, I'm just going to use what we call winging it. Now, one thing I do like to do is maybe do a duplicate copy of the shadow, Control D, and then set the range to maybe like 1. And this just creates 2 copies, so I could turn the bottom copy down, the opacity, and it just creates a little bit more dimension. Now, speaking of dimension, there's a couple of different tricks we could use to dimensionalize this in a 2D way. One thing we could do is duplicate the title, Control D, move it below, and we could do the radial blur effect. We could do CC radial blur, change it to fading zoom, and turn the amount to about -8. Then we could choose color correction curves, and then turn the alpha channel up. So if we look closely, it's a bit faded. But if we turn up the alpha channel, it'll make it more solid. So in this case, it does a pretty good job. I think if we just darken it down, I think that's pretty good. Now, another thing to note is that the shadows are still coming out of the same place. So what we could do is take the two shadow layers, hit S, and just scale them down until this dark edge lines up with that new bevel profile. So we're just going to scale it down. Alright, so this is looking pretty good. Now, speaking of look, one thing we could do is go to our main title, and maybe we'll just change the color to red so it stands out a little bit. And we'll go in here to the shading. I don't know. Maybe I'll just do a color correction. Let's add a curves adjustment and put it to the top. And basically, I just want to darken the text down a bit so that it's more affected by the lighting than it is by the texture. Cool. Now, on the CC glass effect, there's some options under shading, and this actually gives you control over the material. Now, for a stone surface, we want to turn the roughness up, and then maybe the diffuse down. And maybe we'll take this other light here, hit T, and we'll turn it up a bit. And, you know, we could have a lot of fun with the relighting. Now, one quick optimization tip is on the layer where we created the extrusion. Why don't we turn off the CC glass effect and maybe just darken it down a bit. Alright, so now that we have the title set up, we can create whatever we want. We can add moss, we can add cracks, rust, blood, paint chips. This is where we start adding effects. So let's get started by creating this moss effect, since it contains most of the techniques that we need to learn. And then we'll take a look at the paint peeling and corrosion effects at the end. Alright, so let's add some moss to this title. So first thing we'll do is we'll take a copy of the decay alpha, and we'll choose Edit, Duplicate, and we'll turn it off, and then we'll take the copy here, and we'll choose Layer Precompose. We'll move all the attributes, and we'll call this Decay Moss. And then we'll hit OK. Now, we'll double-click on the Decay Moss, and let's move it over to the side here. And I actually just want to turn the alpha channel off. We'll probably use it later on. Now, inside of this comp, let's create a new solid. And we'll call this Moss, and hit OK. Now, there's a really cool effect I like to use called Cell Pattern. And we'll drop this out here, and you've probably seen it, and you thought, what is this? What am I going to do with this? Well, much like the fractal noise effect, this is a great building block effect. So, what we could do is play around with the size and just scale this down a lot. Then we can turn up the contrast just to create little small pieces. Maybe a little less than that. There we go. And then on top of this, we could do something like a turbulent displace. So, turbulent displace. And we'll set the size of this really low. So this is just kind of like a distortion plugin. But we're going to set this really low. And what this will do is just create irregular shaped cells. So we'll set the complexity up to like 3. I don't know, maybe 2. And then speaking of fractal noise, let's add a fractal noise. And we'll turn the contrast up. And we'll set the blending mode to multiply. And what this will basically do is allow us to create some variation in the moss effect. So just bringing the brightness down will reduce the amount of moss. So we'll lock this layer. We'll jump back over here to our decay comp. Now if we hit backslash on the keyboard, it'll bring up the comp, or I think this button does it. Now if we select the title that has our CC glass effect on it, what we can do is duplicate that layer. So we'll choose Edit, Duplicate, and we'll rename this Moss Effects. Now, we could reuse a lot of the settings here, but just so that you can see the process happening, I'm going to just delete the effects. And what I'll do is I'll solo the layer, and now we just have a texture here. So we'll add a curves adjustment, which is just going to give us the ability to color correct it. I think that looks good. Then we're going to add the CC glass effect again, CC glass. And under the surface bump map, we're going to choose decay moss. And so now it's a little bumpy. We'll turn the softness down and the displacement down. We can start to see a little bit. Then we'll go to the light settings and change it to AE lights. So now we're starting to see a bit of the moss effect. Now, to fix the alpha channel, we'll select it. We'll choose Effect, Channel, Set Matte. Then we'll choose the original title alpha channel, the Decay Alpha Comp. And now we've created an alpha channel. But we actually want to do something even more specific. We want to create an alpha channel from this luminance. So we're actually going to create two set matte effects. So we're going to choose Effect, Channel, Set Matte again. But this time, we're going to choose the Decay Moss Comp. And that's this one over here with the bump map. So we'll choose that. Now, nothing happens because there's no alpha channel. There's only a luminance channel. But if we set the matte from alpha channel to luminance, now we've created some transparency. All right, so this is the secret. So now we have a very faded transparent edge. And we're going to try to tighten that up a little bit with a curve adjustment. So add color correction curves. We'll jump over here to the alpha channel, and we'll just crank it up. So grab a point and just crank it up. So check this out. We're creating a layer with an alpha channel of just the little bits of moss. So now we can turn everything back on here, and it's perfect. Thanks for watching. Or we could play around. So a couple of things to note is that we don't have to crank it all the way up. Another thing we could do is if we don't like it being so close to the edge, we can use a matte choker. So check this out. We could do matte, maybe a simple choker, and just drop it between the two set matte effects. And then if we turn this up a little bit, it'll just cut it down a little bit. Now, if we want to soften that edge, we could use a channel blur, channel blur. And this just blurs the alpha channel. So we could do the same thing, drag this up above in between the two matte effects. We could turn the alpha blurriness up a bit. And there you can see it just softens that. Let's just do a little bit of color correction on the moss. So we'll do another copy of the curves, and maybe we'll bring the red channel down a little bit, maybe the green channel up just a touch. And another thing, I think I might want to go to the CC glass effect and lower the height of the map. And also note that if we do a negative, we can create some indentation. So this is really the whole secret to this, is we can create all of these effects from this single effect. So now we could play with the shading and turn up the ambient light. Now, to give it a little bit more dimension, we're going to give it a drop shadow. So we'll go over here to the effects and presets. We'll type drop shadow, perspective drop shadow, and drop it at the bottom here. Now, this is not an effect I use very often, but we could turn the opacity up, and you can see it creates like a little drop shadow and gives it a bit more dimension. And rotate this so it aligns with the direction of the light. Now, let me set the distance to, say, 2. Now, what makes this effect look good, I think, is if you have a really tight alpha channel. So if this is the alpha, and we crank this up so it's really sharp, then I think it looks a little bit nicer when you have like a soft drop shadow versus if it's too soft. But either way, it definitely adds more realism. All right, so now if we jump over here to the Moss comp, hit backslash, it'll open up the timeline. One thing to point out is that if I play around with the settings here and let go, it updates in our final comp. And this can be a fun way to design once you have it set up. You can really play around with the different settings. So we could increase the contrast, and this will create bigger gaps. We could lower the size and just create a variation of looks. There's also another mode called tubular, and it just creates a slightly different looking moss, and I think that could be kind of cool depending on what you're after. Now, if we turn up the complexity of the turbulent displace to say 4 and increase the amount, maybe the size to like 3, we can really create some randomness. So let's jump back over here to this comp. And if we jump over here to the CC glass effect, one thing I want to do is turn the height up just a little bit. And then let's go down here to the shading and set the metal amount down to 0. And that way the specularity will be the color of the light. And then turn the roughness up. Maybe turn the diffuse down and the specular down. And maybe the ambient up. And also let's make the shadow a little tighter. So go to the shadow, maybe set it to a 2 distance. And maybe just add a little bit of red back. So if we jump back into the decay moss comp, one thing to point out is that if we grab the moss effect and lower the brightness of this fractal noise, the moss will begin to deplete. So in fact, this is not a bad way to animate the moss growing on. We could simply animate the brightness. Now, the moss is looking good. Let's come back to this. I'm going to close the moss comp. And what I want to do is open up our decay bevel comp. And in fact, I'm going to turn the moss layer off. So I'll open up the decay bevel. And let's slide that over to the side here. What we want to do is create our cracks in our bevel, and that way it creates the indentation in our title. So what we'll do is create a new solid. And we'll call this cracks. Hit OK. We'll go over here to the effects. We're going to type in cell pattern again. Drop that on here. And we're going to change this to crystals high quality. And that creates these cool chip looking effects. And then I'm going to turn up the amount really high. Maybe to like 1500. So they're really thin. And then let's add a turbulent displace. So turbulent displace. You can search it right here. And we'll scale this down a bit. Maybe complexity 3. And so now we're just getting a little bit more of the rigidness in our comp. And I might even scale up the size of the pattern. So we'll just scale this up maybe to about 100. That looks pretty good. And to make it a little bit thinner, we'll set this to about 1800. Now I want to reuse this layer, so I'm going to pre-compose it. I'll choose Layer, Pre-compose, Move, and we'll call this Cracks. And hit OK. Now I'm going to set the transfer mode to Multiply. And now we can see that we've created some cracks on our main comp. And maybe I'll turn the brightness down just a little bit. And now we can close this comp. Now I want to put a little bit of shading into the cracks. So let's jump back to the project. Grab the cracks comp, drop that over the title, set it to multiply, and to get rid of the alpha channel, we'll choose channel set matte, and we'll choose that same DK alpha. Alright, so now let's turn our moss effect back on, and then we'll jump down to the moss decay, open that up, slide this over. So what we want to do is make it so that the moss only grows around the areas with the cracks. So to do this, we'll jump back to the project, grab the cracks comp, and drop it into the decay moss comp. Now, if we think about this in terms of lightness and darkness, what we need to do is invert this. So we'll choose Effect, Channel, Invert. So now we can see that the moss is growing around the cracks. So we're halfway there. But we don't want it to be perfect. We want to create some randomness and some variation. So what we'll do is we'll set this to multiply. And that'll make it so that the moss is actually part of the comp that we created. So now what we need to do is just make the cracks a little bit thicker. So we'll do a couple of things. We'll choose Effect, Blur, Fast Box Blur. And we'll just blur it out a bit. And that'll make it thicker, but it's a bit faded. So let's boost it up with a curves adjustment. And we'll take this and we'll brighten it up. Alright, so now we're starting to get the idea. So if we lower the blur amount, then we can control where the moss grows out of. But even this is still a bit too perfect. So what we'll do is we'll add a turbulent displace. So we'll come over here, turbulent displace. Now we want to be careful not to displace it too much so that it's no longer aligning. So we'll bring the size down and maybe turn the amount up. Maybe the complexity up just to give it a little bit more detail. But I think that's a good start for what we need. Now, just to point this out, we can open up the cracks comp, and we could change the size of the crack. So we could turn up the size. And now the cracks update, the moss updates. This is that sweet, sweet procedural. Now we have our moss effects right here, and I want to grow some grass out of the moss effects. So a good place to start would be to duplicate that. So we'll choose Edit, Duplicate, and we'll call this Grass Effects. And we'll take this layer, and we're going to add an effect called CC Hair. So we'll take this effect, drop it onto the grass, right on top. And right away, if you look closely, you can see little bits of hair. So let me see if we can get rid of some of these effects. I don't think we need a drop shadow for this. And we'll jump into the CC Hair effect. Here are the different options. We have things like hair length. We have things like weight. We have the density. And the cool thing about this effect is it's coming out of the moss. So if we jump down here to the color, we can change the color to sort of a greenish color. Maybe turn up the thickness. And it's cool because as you turn up the thickness, the weight gets heavier. Genius. Now there's some other options in the map settings. We can add a little bit of noise. Just a little randomness. Maybe turn the density down a bit. Now the hairs are very straight, so just to add a little randomness, we'll add a turbulent displace. So, turbulent displace. Turn the size down really low, like 3. We might also turn the opacity up on this. And maybe darken down the hair color a bit. Now notice that the inheritance actually grabs the color from the moss, which is kind of interesting. So depending on what the color is, you can simplify your workflow even more. But yeah, so we'll bring the thickness down a bit. Now, you can see there's a little bit of lighting on this. If we go to the shading, maybe turn the specular down a bit. Now, there is a way to add a little bit of wind blowing, like in the original example. And the way to do that is to create a new solid. We'll call this wind map. Hit OK. We'll take a fractal noise. And we don't really have to change the settings, just animate the evolution. Maybe turn the complexity down to like 2. And then pre-compose it. So layer, pre-compose, move all attributes, wind map. And hit OK. So then we'll turn that off. Grab the grass effect. And for the map layer, let's choose the wind map. And so now if we just take a look at this, sort of just kind of blows in the wind here. I'll play this back real quick. So now we've got realistic plant physics inside of After Effects. All right, well, maybe that's a little overstated, but still pretty cool. So let's turn that off and maybe bring the strength down a bit. And let's add a color correction to this. And this is the part where I think we just want to add some variation, so we could take a copy of the grass now and hit Control D. And let's put one down below, even further. And scale it down a little bit. And then we could randomize some of the settings. So let's see. Maybe take the length down just a bit. And the weight up. And then these ones in the back here, it's these guys right here, maybe we'll darken them down so it looks like they're a little bit in shadow. And the real trick to the grass and any kind of vegetation is just a lot of randomness and variation. So you could do things like duplicate the copy, and maybe these ones are a little bit more random looking, so we can add noise. But just keep them really short so that they just create texture almost. So one thing we could do is take this light, hit AA, and let's change it to more of a warm colored light. And then I'm going to do a color correction adjustment layer. So new adjustment layer. Let's do a curves adjustment and maybe add a little bit of red. Bring the blue down just a touch. We don't want it to look too orange. And then maybe a tint effect, just to desaturate it a bit. The material of the stone texture is a little bit shiny, so let's go down here to the title. I think this is it. And we'll go to the CC glass effect. And we'll turn up the ambient, which will brighten the letters a bit. And then we could turn the roughness up. And then turn the specular down. And then we could even tweak the color correction of the stone if there's just a touch more contrast there. And now that looks a little bit more like the Legends of the Hidden Temple on Nickelodeon, which is what we want, obviously. And now we can play around with the environment a bit. I have this light spot. You could do optical flares. We could just scale this up. Maybe add a curves adjustment to it. We'll put it below the color correction. And just add a little bit of red. And scale it up. And maybe drop the blue down just a touch.